Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. One of the things that we confront as teachers is that the students of knowledge in the U.S., or those who purport to be students of knowledge, are very distracted. So you find that they they don't have a sense of direction. So one minute they want to study this, the next minute they want to study that. They start something, they leave it, they argue with the teachers. So you find that the quality of the student is one in which there's a lot of things that are wanting. And that's not to say that, some of us who tried to study with the ulama didn't have those same characteristics. But it's a fitna, because it creates more harm in the student and in the teacher, but particularly in the student than it does anything, because the teacher can move on. Yeah, it makes the teacher sad and sometimes depressed and so on and so forth. But what happens is that the students themselves don't build systematically their understanding of the deen. So what they're left with is a piecemeal understanding of Islam. A piecemeal understanding of Islam would be good if they operated like bees. A bee takes from here and from there, from here and from there, and has the ability to take benefit from all of those things, right, at the end of the day. But the students of knowledge are not at the level of bees, because you don't know what's beneficial and what's harmful, what's suitable, what's not suitable, right? Especially in the early stages. Maybe in the late stages or the upper stages, some of the ulama classify studying knowledge into three categories: the beginning stage, the intermediate stage, the advanced stage. When you start moving into the intermediate stage, then you have the ability that you don't have in the beginning stage. This all varies according to what's being studied and to who's studying and to their capacity and their maturity and understanding and comprehension. So then, it's important for the student to focus, at least to finish something. Finish something from the beginning to the end. We talked about this before, but it's something that has to be repeated again. Now we have a lot of people wanting to study the Arabic language. And this is a trend that was present in the past as well, about a decade ago or more. But the reality is that it's a very noble and good pursuit to study the Arabic language. Right? Very noble, very good pursuit to study the Arabic language. The problem is this: that mastery of the Arabic language won't come in 3 months, and it won't come in 6 months. So the students are delusioned in thinking that if I focus only on the Arabic language, then I'll get what I need. Because our first language is not the language of the Arabs, the question that has to be asked is, when will we come to an understanding of the deen? And it's true that Imam Shatibi rahimahullah, he said that our knowledge of the deen is in proportion to our knowledge of the Arabic language. But there's an assumption there, first of all, that there's some understanding of the Arabic language. So then it obliges the student to study in his own language to the extent that he has at least the basics that are sufficient to cover what is obligatory. And I would add to that, as an observer, not only to cover that which is obligatory, but to remove the doubt and the confusion which is present in the mind of many of the young Muslims and those who are students of knowledge who may not be young. because people are confused over a number of issues regarding the deen. So to remove that confusion and to get a grasp of the foundation of the deen, which is obligatory and an obligation, and that which we find to be an obligation in the deen, if we can't practice that except by engaging in some other activity, then that activity itself becomes an obligation. So for instance, salah is an obligation in Islam, but salah can't be practiced without wudu. So wudu is not an obligation in itself, it is a means. So that means becomes an obligation because without it, you can't practice salah. Although wudu can be considered an act of ibadah in and of itself, but in general it's considered a means. So the same thing with seeking knowledge. If you're not going to be able to understand what's obligatory upon you on your own, which is impossible, and it's not the way of the Muslims anyway. The way that the Muslims have always understood the deen is that they get their deen from the ulama. And they see the practice of the ulama. But we live in a time period in which the ulama are far and few in between when it comes to the Muslims living in the West. You have ulama in the West contrary to the opinion of some, right? You have ulama and you have some major scholars. They may not be the highest level, but you have some major scholars. Absence or lack of knowledge of something doesn't mean that you have knowledge of the lack. In principle, it's a logical concept. It's a principle which is drawn from the science of logic. Just because you don't know about something, right, doesn't mean that you know about a deficiency in reality. Right? Just because your knowledge is deficient doesn't mean that you have knowledge of the deficiency. So some people, they claim because they don't know any ulama that there's no ulama. Just because they don't know any ulama doesn't mean that there's no ulama. This is a big mistake. Just even logically speaking, what about if there's somebody that's a big scholar that never announced himself or even herself and you never knew about that person, right? So it's an issue that we put ourselves first and our egos first when it comes to understanding, when it comes to knowledge, right? So the student of knowledge then is obligated to establish the foundation in the deen. And how are you going to get that foundation in the deen, which is something that you need to practice, if you're going to wait a year or 2 years in studying Arabic? So then, by default, studying in your own language, the basics, becomes a necessity. While studying the Arabic language, while memorizing the Quran, right? Even if you say that the greater portion of your effort is going to be put into the Arabic language and memorization of the Quran, and some of your time is going to be given to Islamic studies, so to speak, then there's no harm in that. You reach the goal. You reach the goal. But some people, they yuhibbuna al-ajila. Some people, they just look at what the case is right now. You know, they don't look at the future. They don't look at the future. You know. So at the moment, they want to study this, they want to study that. They don't see, what it could be like for themselves if they slow down a little bit, they establish their foundation in the deen. They could be very strong Muslims and from the ulama, inshallah. So we have a lot of bright students. We have a lot of people with critical minds. But we don't have people with substance. Meaning that has to be toned down. The student of knowledge needs to be humble. Knowledge needs to humble us. And then knowledge What is considered knowledge according to our ulama, our imams, rahmatullahi alayhim jami'a. Knowledge is understanding and practice. In other words, it has to be put into practice. That's from the character of the Sahaba. Right. From the character of the Sahaba, that they took what they understood and they put it into practice. Therefore, it's knowledge. And that's a big issue. And so a lot of what we experience within ourselves, we wouldn't experience it. A lot of the anxiety and the frustration, this and that, if we slow down a little bit and just learn the foundational stuff. And to learn the foundational stuff means that you have to have respect for the teachers to take benefit. It doesn't mean that you put the teacher on a pedestal or this and that, but there has to be some respect. But when you have a critical mind, everything is critique and this and that, then how is it that, how are you going to benefit from the people that are teaching when everything is a critique and suspicion and this and that? And that comes from the internet reality. That comes from having communities which are broken down or dysfunctional, I should say. I'm not even going to say they started from the beginning as wholesome communities, but dysfunctionality. When you have communities without teachers, without imams that are giving the people time, and without ulama, without muftis, this is a fitna. Without people to memorize the Quran from, this is a fitna. This is a fitna, because that means that ignorance is what dominates in that community. By default, that may not be the case in actuality, but it appears to be the case. That would be a community of ignorance. And so you can't really expect a lot of good to come from a community which doesn't put knowledge as a priority. You can't expect much good to come from that community. Because Islam requires knowledge in order to practice. The two conditions of a ruling in order to implement a ruling or any act of the deen is knowledge and capacity. That's what we learn in Usul al-Fiqh. Knowledge and capacity. So you have to have the knowledge and you have to have the ability, right, before you can act on something in the deen. And so that takes us back to the obligation of talib ilm. If knowledge is the only way that we can implement the deen, knowledge is a means to implementing the deen. So then, by default, according to the principle that was mentioned earlier, seeking knowledge becomes an obligation because establishing the deen can only be established through knowledge. Right? And if that's the case, right, then what? Seeking knowledge is an obligation. Because establishing the deen is an obligation, and you can't establish that obligation except by seeking knowledge. So priorities become important then in seeking knowledge. Priorities become important in seeking knowledge. There's another group that says that what you begin with is tawheed. And that in itself, as a da'wah, as a claim, as a position, appears to be correct. But in practice is incorrect. Because if you take that literally, that means that you're just going to be focusing on learning Aqidah and not knowing how to pray Salah. Because the study of Aqidah is a study of a lifetime, right? So what's sufficient is to learn the basics of La ilaha illallah, the basics, and immediately learn how to pray Salah. If you were only to study the tafsir of Surah Al-Ikhlas or Surah Al-Ikhlas, then there would be no problem. You would understand the basics of Aqidah. We have the definition of Islam in the Hadith of Jibreel, which Islam is defined as the Shahadatan and the Arkan. The Arkan al-Arba'a. All of them are Arkan. We say al-Arkan al-Khamsa. They're all pillars of the deen, the Shahada, the Salah, and what pertains to the Salah. The Salah, fasting, Hajj, Zakat. Not necessarily in that order, but those are the pillars. So then, a good student of knowledge will focus on that reality. And like some of the ulama said, when they began studying, they didn't have guidance in understanding how to implement the deen. That's our situation. Some of us don't have guidance. We're quick on the internet. We're quick to say, this person said this, I heard this lecture, but we don't know how to utilize it. Again, we're not like bees. We take from here and there, but we don't know how to make sense of it all. The bee takes from here and from there, but knows how to synthesize everything into one. Because the bee was given that capacity. But the capacity of the student of knowledge at the beginning level is not that. Right? You can't take from here and there and make sense. Not to mention, and some people don't like this, that there's bid'ah and misunderstanding. There's misunderstanding of the deen. There's ignorance of the deen. There's bad behavior. There's su'ul akhlaq, as they say. Then there's also those who don't look to unite the ummah by communicating that which is agreed upon. They focus on that which is disagreed upon. So this creates a confusion in the student of knowledge which is destructive. And then there is those groups that focus on the most controversial or the most complicated issues that the ummah is confronting in the reality of life. So they focus on issues which are beyond the capacity of the normal Muslim to address. So the Muslim then is confused. So being systematic and being patient becomes important. Arabic is important. Hadith science is important. But what takes priority is understanding the deen and understanding that which is necessary to practice. And that's why, contrary, some people are already they're already looking for how to practice and this and that. So they read a little bit about this, a little bit about that. They have some idea of making salah. But my experience is that has forced me, the way that the students are now that I have encountered, because of the confusion that they have, it forces me to first teach them usul al-fiqh before teaching them anything else. Because as soon as you teach them fiqh, they begin to debate with you. And they don't understand how to benefit from the Quran and the Sunnah directly. They have so many questions. Do I follow a madhab? Don't follow a madhab? Where's the dalil? Where's not the dalil? There's so many issues that they confront that you're obligated to clarify that confusion that they have. So usul al-fiqh, even though is an issue of complexity, is a science of complexity, you almost have to teach usul al-fiqh first to humble the brothers, so that they do we follow the aqidah of the salaf or the aqidah of the khalaf. Do you know anything about metaphor in the Arabic language? It's not only that they ask questions, that they're debating. They're debating, and they think that they know. So that means the manzuma al-ma'lumatiyya, the network of information is not in place. They don't have a network to organize their information, as they see. So, but if the students were a little patient, they would grow tremendously. We all are students. We all are students. Everybody's not at the same level, and that's why Imam Ahmed rahimahullah considered himself a student of knowledge when he was an imam in the deen. Okay, so then the chapter that we're on, we'll continue inshallah with the chapter.